Let's start with some basic things about the mechanics of a swing.
I think an absolute critical point in the swing is the point where the hands interface with the club. So obviously this is the point where the forces, where the golfer interacts with the club. The golfer imparts their forces and torques, right, and controls the path of the club at that point. So the hub path is the path that the hands take through the swing. So if you were to kind of be very specific, so when you grab the club, right, the hub path is the path of this point right here.
Where the two hands join each
Yeah,
other?
the two hands join together, and the hub path, again, the significance is just this is where the club and the golfer interact. So the golfer does all kinds of interesting movements, generates all kinds of energy, and applies forces and torques. Ultimately, what happens here is the most important. So, and it's important in what kinetic or forces and torques, energy, power is happening at that point. But the path is important too, because how this path is shaped has a lot to do with how much energy the golfer transfers to the club, and also controls the outward movement of the club.
Okay, so we've used all these terms, so let's run through them real quick. When we say forcing, give us a basic description of
All right.
forcing.
Well, actually,
for a golfer.
I'll give you a couple of equations
Great.
here, since you're talking to an engineer.
You are the math lead here.
The neat thing is what happens with the club and what happens with the golfer are all dictated by the laws of nature, which are invariant. So you can always count on them.
Okay.
Right? So
if we built a swing on them, we could probably repeat it.
it's very consistent. Yeah. Now, the behavior of the club can be described fully with Newton's laws. So you have your force equals your mass times your acceleration. So there's the first one that you mentioned.
So that's force.
Force. So this equation is concerned with what's happening when you move things in a straight line. All right? So when you push on something, you're applying a force. The resistance to that force is the mass. So when you pick up a club and you move it up and down, you're not rotating it, what you feel is its mass. The response is the acceleration. All right? So that's what's happening when things are moving in a straight line. Okay? Then you have the other equation, which is your torque equals I times the angular acceleration. All right, so this is the rotational version of Newton's second law. So a torque is a twisting force. So when you tighten something with the wrench, you're putting a torque on it. There's other ways to generate a torque, but basically it's a twisting force. Equals the inertia, which is the resistance to angular acceleration. So when you move the club like this, you're overcoming its inertia. And the kinematic response is the angular acceleration. Okay?
Okay. So the golfer is applying both of those to the club.
The golfer is applying a force and a torque. The response of the club to that is the acceleration and the angular acceleration. So this is the response. And I'll just get a little bit ahead here, but what makes teaching a challenge, in my opinion, is this is what you see.
That's what we see.
That's what you see, but this is what you do.
So if we watch golf on TV, we're seeing the right side of that.
We're seeing the right side of this.
Okay.
The golfer feels the mass, feels the inertia, and somehow has to work through their own mind to figure out how to modify the forces that I apply, the torques that I apply, to get the resultant accelerations. And the velocities and positions that
So that's an
give you the
excellent
swing.
way to just go right through golf, what you see, what you feel, and what you did.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned that force was in a straight line.
Right.
But in golf, the club moves on a curve.
Okay.
So that kind of complicates the force a little bit?
Well, the force changes. The force can change direction. So let's
Okay.
again look at the hub path.
So that's the path that the center of the hands take.
Right, right.
Okay.
So here might be your club at some point in the hub path.
Okay.
So your hands are interacting with the club here on the hub path.
Okay.
Now the direction that you force it can be here, then it can be here, then it can be here. It can change during the swing. And you can feel that as you swing the club. You can feel yourself pulling on the club, which is representative of the linear force that you feel. So it's a straight line force, but that force can change direction.
Okay.
Okay? So that's how that can change direction, and that ultimately affects the acceleration. Now the linear acceleration here is very interesting in that it has two parts to it. All right, so this linear acceleration is what it includes what most people think of. It's you're changing the speed with respect to time. So as you're pulling on this, as you get closer to impact, obviously the club is speeding up, right? But also an acceleration, a linear acceleration occurs when you change an object's direction. So here we're changing the direction, right? And that change of direction requires a force. And that gives you what's called your normal acceleration. So when you're driving your car around a curve, you feel a force. That's sort of indicative of a normal acceleration. So that's occurring as well. So you're speeding it up. That's one form of the linear acceleration. And you're changing the direction. That's another form. And then that's very evident at the bottom where you feel like you're pulling the club straight up and you're changing the path at the bottom there.
So golfers always hear the term centripetal and centrifugal force in a golf swing.
Centripetal, I mean, that has a very distinct, not distinct, I would say that they have different definitions, but really the way that you want to think of both of them is when you're, well, the easiest way is when you take a ball on a string and you swing it around your head. I don't know how much time you spend doing that, but if you do, when it's that tension that you feel in the string. All right, so all objects want to go in a straight line at a constant velocity. When you swing something that's not going in a straight line, you make it move in a straight line, you have to pull on it to change its path. There's the force. And that's the resultant acceleration is due to the fact that you're changing the path. So if something goes in a circle with a constant speed, it's still accelerating. And the direction of that acceleration is towards the center of curvature. Essentially, it's the acceleration that happens when you change the path of something. It points towards the center of curvature. So that's actually a big deal. And at the bottom of the swing, the club is going fast enough and the radius of curvature of the club is significant enough that you have to pull on it pretty hard to change its path.
So the golfer down at the bottom of the swing is really trying to change the path of the club, and it's much harder to do down at the bottom than it would be up at the top of the swing when the velocity of the club is not as fast.
Exactly. And that acceleration, we use like equation. So it's the velocity of the club squared divided by the radius of curvature of the club. So the faster the club is going, the harder it is to change the direction. So that's...
So things at the bottom of the swing, when it's more difficult to change the direction, we might see the golfer using more of their body segments, their larger parts. Like I know when you see junior golfers or lady golfers or long hitters, they'll come up on their toes and things like that. So the club has so much velocity, they're trying to change the path by recruiting whatever they can to do that.
Yeah. I mean, the loading from the club at the bottom, because the velocity is many times greater than the actual weight of the club. But yeah, it's that velocity squared is pretty significant. So Also, too, at the bottom, the club is going pretty fast, and the ability to apply more energy to the club to speed it up becomes much more difficult. So how much more energy you can apply at the bottom is somewhat determined by your ability to generate power. So power becomes significant near the bottom of the swing.
So when you say power, it's the rate at which you're applying these things to the club.
It's the rate at which your energy is being transferred to the club is right, yeah.
Okay. Can a golfer change the path and radiuses to help transfer energy?
Yeah, sure. And then that, I think, is very indicative of a golfer's skill level, and also indicative of what they can do relative to their own physiology. So manipulating, well, this goes to the complexity of the swing, right? So there's the hand path again. So here's the club in one position, in another position. So the golfer, as they apply their forces and torques during the hub path, can effectively shape the club or the hub path and coordinate that with their applying forces and torques to either retard the movement of the club or accelerate the movement of the club, and ultimately how much energy is transferred. Yeah, so there's that complex series of events that are happening all at the same time. You shape the club head or the hand path, but you're also reacting to what the club is doing there, and then how you're applying your torques and forces, and the timing of that determines quite a bit where this ends up.
So like you said originally, it's never one thing.
No.
We'd like it to be.
Yeah.
So you've used the word torque,
Okay.
and you're famous for the terms alpha, beta, gamma. And pretty much everybody watching this has heard those terms. It was in Golf Digest with Brian Manzella. Where'd you come up with those terms, and what does that mean, and how does torque relate to the movement of a club?
All right, so torque, when you torque something, you twist it, right? And you apply a twisting force. So you can twist it along the long axis of the shaft, which I think most people can appreciate. You can twist it in this direction, which most people will visualize as the most important torque to swinging the club. But then you can also twist it in this direction too, to change the relative plane which the club moves in. So the convention that we use, that we've found sort of most illustrative of these different torques, is the, as you mentioned, the alpha, beta, gamma convention. So our convention is the alpha is this twist in this direction here, so it's the main swinging torque. That swinging torque can be generated by the relative movement of the hands this way and the contribution of the wrists as well. So that's the main torque. The beta torque is the movement in this direction, right? And so that would alter the relative plane that the club moves in. And then the gamma is the twisting about the long axis of the shaft. So that's the convention that we use, that we feel is most illustrative of how the golfer torques the club, or applies torques to the club during the downswing.
So the torque that the golfer is doing, so a golfer can apply a force, and they could also twist on the club.
Yes.
While they're swinging. Now, where does the actual center of mass of the club weigh in when you're doing this? Like, let's say, for example, you forced it in a different direction than the center of mass. That would create an angular movement, would it not?
Yeah, sure. You can create angular movement in a variety of ways. One certainly is to apply the torque with the wrist, so you can torque it this way. You can torque it by moving the hands and sort of pushing them in opposite directions. That's another way. If you pull the club, so let's say you're pulling the club like this, the center of the mass of the club, the balance point is about here. Right? Now if you move the club in purely a straight line, and the center of mass is not in that line, it's going to cause a twisting to try and line up. So that's another way that you can angularly move the club. When you move your hands out and down for your hub path, you can actually get the club to move without applying any torque. So that's another way that you can impart an angular movement on the club. Did I cover everything there?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's great. So, so what we found in swinging the club, that the golfer predominantly applies a force as opposed to a torque, right? So that's the predominant movement, the linear force. So things like pulling with the arms and using the body would be more involved in forcing.
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, physiologically, being able to apply, a human can apply more force than they can the torques. The torques are limited somewhat by the strength of the wrists, which are obviously not quite as strong as the strength of the arms. So the arms more or less dictate how much force you can apply, where the wrists more or less limit the amount of torque that you can apply. If you apply no torque to a club whatsoever, you can still swing it pretty fast, and
And you can still hit a ball.
you can still hit a ball.
So that would be like a limp-wristed swing.
Right. On the other hand, if you hold the club at the bottom and you try and just twist it without moving, you're not going to generate as much club head speed. So, in my opinion, it's more about your ability to apply a force over the range of motion than applying a torque over the range of motion, although they both contribute. Generally, we found that the energy contribution comes more from your force applied over this distance than the torque.
When you say energy.
Yeah, sure. Because it is really all about energy. All right, so keep drawing this here. So there's the hub path again.
And this hub path you're drawing is the down from the top of the back swing to impact. Right. That's our area of interest.
Right, sure. So this movement of the hands and the angular movement of the club during the downswing represents your range of motion. How far are you moving the club angularly? How far are you moving the club linearly? So your energy is equal to a combination of the force times the linear distance plus the torques times the angular distance. And each one of these has 3 parts to it. Okay? But the main ones are pretty easy to see. So the main force would be around here. The main torque would be the alpha, the swing torque. The other components contribute. Now, the mechanics definition of energy in this context is the force times the distance. Okay? So that's one component of the energy, and ultimately this energy gets converted into kinetic energy. And that kinetic energy of the the club head is what ultimately gets transferred to the ball. And then it also comes from the torque over the angular distance times the angular distance. So both of those contribute to the energy. This, most of the time, is about 2/3 of the energy. This is about 1/3 of the energy. And because they're equal contributors within each grouping, this explains why somebody who's big and strong doesn't necessarily have an advantage over somebody who's not. Because, say, somebody can generate only half of the force, somebody bigger than them. Well, it's how they can apply it over this distance, right? So peak force, the ability, somebody's strength is not a good indicator, but what's a better indicator is how they can apply that force over the whole range of motion. Okay? And same thing with the torque. So peak torque, it's important that you can generate torque, but it's more important that you can generate the torque over the entire angular displacement of the club.
So as a golf player, ways that they could affect the hub path and the paths could help you do it over a distance.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, sure. So, again, this is just the energy, but how the club moves, so the angular displacement depends a lot on the shape of this path. So the path will affect, with the torques, how the club wants to move out. So you might better explain this in golfing terms, how this interaction happens. But from a mechanics point of view, the hand path plus the forces plus the torque all contribute to when this wants to come out and how fast it happens. So you can either accelerate it. If this was a very sharp curve here, this would want to flip out very quickly.
Right.
If it was very flat, then this would want to lag behind until maybe it starts to shorten here and you want to flip out. So yeah, why don't you explain this in golf terms?
So a good analogy of that, when you said, because lag is a popular term,
Okay.
trying to lag the club. So moving this thing, so if the hub path moved in a very flattish way, it would want to keep the tip of the club back.
Yes.
So something like cashing a fishing rod, the initial part, or surf cast, it would move pretty flat.
Yep.
And then if the person casting curved their hands, it would help flip it out.
Yes.
Right. So that's a good way to see it. So people who might have the club moving out too early could look at their hub path and see if it's too curved too early or if they need to adjust that.
Right, right.
And by moving it out more this way, it will also help keep the club, which we'll get to, in the master class, inside the path of the hands longer,
Yes.
which is an advantage for that portion. But I think for the regular fundamental approach, a lot of people in golf think that they don't want the club to move out. They think that they're better off trying to keep the club back and then magically it's going to come out. But what we found mechanically is we want it to move out and take energy out of the golfer.
Right.
So maybe you could explain when that is best to happen and why in pretty much every golf swing the hands really the hub path starts to slow down a little there.
Yeah, sure. Again, a lot of this shaping and timing is based not so much on what a golfer's or a human strengths are, but their weaknesses. So since the torques generated by the wrists are somewhat limited, and the speed at which a force can be applied is limited, the power is limited, there's other ways in which the body will compensate to move the club out. And shaping of the hand path is a huge one. So the relative radius here will either help move this out or will keep it back here, okay? And as the club speeds up, right, the wrists will have a difficult time keeping up speed-wise to move this out. So oftentimes a golfer will start to shorten the hand path here.
When you say shorten, pull up.
Pull up, shorten the radius.
We'll get to that when we get to some curvature.
And that will help move the club out, so it ultimately lines up here, and more significantly will help transfer more of the energy to the club. So at this point, it's the body is generating the energy within the joints, mostly from a bottom-up approach, and then as we get here, we're moving the energy outward from the body, the arms, and out to the club. So how this shapes, or the shape that this thing takes, will have a big effect. Now, were some of the specifics you wanted me to mention?
Yeah, so this is a key spot because it's often talked about in a swing, because this is an important area where the golfer might have their last moments to influence the club, because it happens so fast.
Right.
So could we say that the hub path slowing down would be a response to that club swinging out?
Oh yeah, sure. So the old trebuchet analogy. So
When you say trebuchet, is that
trebuchet.
thing that goes...
Yeah. So the lower arm of the trebuchet would be the representative of the body here, and what the golfer will do oftentimes is will move the hand path in such a way that the radius of curvature of the club starts to come inward, and that what it does is it increases the effective inertia of the club, which will take energy away from the golfer and move it out to the club.
And that's something we want to have happen.
You want that to happen. You'll see that effect. The hands will slow down and the club will move faster.
So, as a golf professional, players who use that to their advantage will look a lot smoother than people who aren't doing that and are trying to do all these things to try to hit the ball.
Oh, sure.
So, this ability here, and now we'll get into the center of curvature and more about the hub path.
Okay.
But so this ability here to change the path of the hub and what the club is rotating around, can that help the golfer put energy into the club?
Oh, it's critical into transferring the energy to the club.
Might
certainly.
that be all the golfer has left at that point in the swing to do?
Yeah, and there is no more or almost no torque work, this part coming into the club. Same thing with this. These things are now happening so fast that the energy contribution starts to drop off from these components, and the way it gets transferred to the club is by shaping the path of the hands, and this movement upwards will cause this thing to swing out.
All right, so Steve, you wrote a series of papers about the golf swing. A lot of papers. You wrote papers about tennis, softball, and some other things. So a common theme in all the papers is this hub path, which we talked about.
The hub path.
So one of the things that you've passed on to me, and one of the things that we use in our teaching curriculum, is the center of curvature of this hub path. So hopefully you can explain that to us here.
Center of curvature. Okay, so let me draw the hub path again. All right, so obviously the hub path is circular, but it's not a constant radius circular. Okay, so the degree to which this curves is the radius of curvature. So when we look at the hub path, we look at a couple of things. We look at how much of a radius it has at given points in the swing, and we also trace the path
Of the
center of curvature. So, and it too changes quite a bit. So you have the radius, which changes, and you have the center of curvature path, which changes.
Okay.
Two.
So like we talked about briefly in the last segment, when we talked about helping delay the outward movement of the club, we might expect to see that radius get bigger.
That's right. That's right.
Because it would be a much bigger curve.
Right.
And then when we want the club to excite out or move out, we would make a much sharper curve, like the bottom of the fishing cast, and then that radius would shrink. It would be a much smaller circle with a smaller radius at that particular time.
Sure. And that we see that in golf pretty significantly, but we see that in tennis, we see that in softball. When you the casting of a fishing pole is a great example. If you've ever tried to crack a whip, I mean, you can mentally do that, and you see the straight line, and then you pull it right at the end. It happens all the time.
Okay, so that's center of curvature. That's our definition of what a center of curvature is.
Right.
And we have three of them.
We have three of them.
We have the center of curvature of the hub path.
Right.
We have of the club.
Club. Right.
So what the club is rotating around
That's
at
right.
that given time, and also of the club head.
That's correct.
So so it's basically telling us how big the circle is getting or shrinking during the swing.
And how they interact with each other, and it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated, but a big factor for a golfer and how they can improve their game, which is I'm going to show them over time,
Okay.
is when this starts to get smaller, when this starts to curve, and how the club moves out is a huge indicator of skill.
Yeah.
For consistency of contact.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, the trebuchet thing is a great example. If you ever get a chance to just kind of watch a YouTube video of one. The neat thing is with the trebuchet, the torque is only applied down here. There is no torque. It's just a pivot joint. There is nothing happening there. So what you see is, as this thing goes, these relative lengths are picked such that as this comes around, this is going to whip around on its own. And you watch, this slows down as the energy is transferred out here.
So they're not trying to slow that segment down. It's slowing down as
the energy is being transferred out. Now we have more control over that because we don't have a fixed pivot. We have a hand path.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so we also have the ability to apply more energy here.
So one of our elements is the hub path optimizer.
Oh yeah, sure.
So you wrote a whole paper on optimization. It's mentioned in several papers.
Okay.
And one was a kinetic constrained one. Can you explain to us a little bit about that? That's your most complex paper, by the way.
Yeah, I confused myself. Now actually, so we mentioned repeatedly that a lot of what happens in the golf club or golf swing is based upon the limitations that the golfer has at the interaction point where the hands grasp the club, right? How much torque they apply and how much force they can apply, and as well as the power, right? How fast they can transfer the energy to the club. So what the optimization paper talks about is within a given subject's kinematic limitations. So we looked at several subjects and we analyzed a typical swing from those subjects, and we figured out, okay, this golfer can generate so much force, so much torque, so much power, etc. And we designated those as their kinetic maximum. So if this is all they can do, right, what can we affect in their swing to help generate more club head
and it
speed?
was a change in the hub path.
Right. And we found that for every subject, modification of the hub path to some degree would effectively, within those kinetic constraints, not exceeding those, would generate more club head speed. So I think it if nothing else, it effectively proves that the path of the hands is very significant in generating club head speed.
As Dr. Nesbit continues to point out the importance of the hub path, let's take a look at a couple of places where you could start to learn how to map out your own hub path. So here's a quick look at the first book, the first Jacobs 3D publication, which is called Elements of the Swing, which can be found at jacobs3d.com and on Amazon. And here we talk about this hub, exactly where it is and its influence. Now, when it comes to mapping out this hub path, we show you in this fundamental book the different ways in which it can be mapped out. And we drive home the fact that it's going to be based a lot on viewpoint and where you position the camera and how you go about doing that. So you definitely want to take note of the possibilities of the hub path. And the wider it is, the more it's going to want to delay the outward movement of the club, and the more curved it is, the more it's going to want to help move the club out. In the full textbook, Science of the Swing, we spent a whole entire chapter, chapter 2, on the hub path, both what it is, forces transform to this hub path in the different forms, and also how to map out your hub path as well, as we give you different ways that center of curvatures are drawn. Also, we got into the complex interaction between the center of curvature of the hub, the overall club, and the path of the club head, and how those intertwine and tie together are really one of the best features of the Science of the Golf Swing book. So now that you know how important the hub is, we've given you lots of ways that you can now analyze it.
Let me put Newton's second law there again. So we have the torques equals I alpha. All right, so this is the angular version of Newton's second law. So these are the torques that the golfer applies to the club at the handle. And this is the inertia. This is the resistance to those torques that the golfer feels that hinders the movement of the club angularly. And then this is the angular acceleration. So this is the response to these torques. So these are obviously inversely proportional to each other. The lower the inertia, the greater the acceleration, and vice versa. Now, the inertia, that term is very interesting. All right. Yeah. All right. So the inertia, this is mass moment of inertia. This is resistance to the angular acceleration. Depends upon the point that you're rotating the club about. So that equals,
Which is not the hands.
sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, right? So it equals the inertia about the mass center, and I'll show you these things relative to the club in a minute, plus the mass of the club times this radius squared. Right,
So
let me
that
just
distance is squared.
Right. So let me just explain these things here. So you have your club and you have your balance point, which is pretty easy to find. That point is the mass center of the club.
Just probably somewhere right
Yeah,
above
so
that.
it's
Right.
pretty right. So when you take this and you grip it about the mass center and you rotate it back and forth, the resistance you get when you change the direction is the mass moment of inertia about the mass center. Right? Now this inertia depends upon the point that you're rotating. So as you move away from that point, right, put it here so you don't feel the gravity effect, it gets harder and harder to change its direction. Right? So this point of rotation, which I'm forcing to be right here, is this distance from the mass center. This distance. So as you move away from the mass center, this radius increases, and so the effective inertia of the whole club significantly increases. Right? So by the time you get to the handle, actually this version of the inertia dominates over that one. Alright. Now, in the past, everybody just assumed that the point of rotation of the club was about the grip point. Right? So that inertia here would be the inertia about the grip point. Okay? Now, what we found, and there's your hub path, is that as the club comes around, the rotation point is actually pretty far in, and it actually moves up here near impact.
Which the golfer has control over changing.
The golfer has control. Now this is the point of rotation of the club. This is the grip point. That extra distance here adds to that, and the effective inertia of the club increases significantly. Now, it does a couple of things. It becomes harder for the golfer to angular accelerate the club at the bottom, but what it does beneficially is it will extract more energy from the golfer.
So what you're saying, in layman's terms, is we have a pretty much predetermined amount of this,
Right?
and then this changes based around the rotation center
Right.
and affects the angular acceleration.
That's right. That's right. So tracking the inertia of the club based upon the point that it rotates tells you a ton about what the golfer is doing relative to the feel of the club. So near the top of the swing, the golfer will effectively move the center of rotation closer to the center.
So at the top of the swing, it's basically rotating right around the center of mass.
Right,
So if they did apply a big torque to it, it would go out.
right.
So
right.
they would do stuff that would probably limit torque at that time. They could even do negative and just move the club with the hub path or their forcing feature.
Yes.
And they have the ability to keep it that way longer by affecting the paths. So there might be an advantage to essentially hiding the inertia of the club, like a Sergio Garcia or somebody who really, I won't hit you.
Okay. Yes.
I need you.
Yeah.
Right. The club, when the club stays back behind and there's that lagging position in the club, essentially they're hiding the inertia and waiting for it to move out later.
Yeah. Yeah. And I the more we look at this, the more fundamental it seems to the swing. So you control the relative inertia that the golfer feels to first reduce it at the beginning and then increase it at the end to effectively help transfer more of the inertia out there.
So if this stayed the same, right, and we just swung the club in a constant thing, we would be limited into what we can do.
Yeah, sure. At the beginning, you would effectively, if the point of rotation of the club was always about the hub path, you would make things harder on yourself at the beginning, and then you would make things, you wouldn't transfer as much energy at the end. A couple of places you can see this. If you've ever seen like a little kid swing a baseball bat that's too
Right.
big for him.
That's in the Baseball Explosive Golf Show. I'm
Yeah.
sending
So
out.
you see them. There's rotate the bat around their wrist. When you watch somebody like who's a big home run hitter, their point of rotation is closer to the center of curvature of the body. You see that to a lesser effect with a golfer, but it still occurs. So I think it's really key to understand the interactions between the torques, the inertia of the club, and the angular response based upon this view of inertia, that it's not a constant quantity, but it depends upon the point of rotation of the club. So part of it you can manipulate to make the club feel less inertially resistant to you, and then at the end you help yourself by, the old ice skate. You move your hands out and the energy, you change the way the things rotate.
What's beneficial for this for golfers and golf teachers or golf enthusiasts who are probably gonna watch our videos is the fact that if we didn't have this portion, we'd be pretty limited to what we can do. Our basic conclusions would be pretty limited. But by having this as an option, we can control this actual center of rotation of the club and use it to our advantage throughout the course of the swing.
Yeah, and from a teacher's point of view, that's perfect. From a mechanic's point of view, this is what's happening. So our part is to say this is what's happening, and when you see something happening all the time, then at some point you have to conclude that it's fundamental to the swing. And so
So a golfer, like we've always said, the hub path, how they shape things, how you might want to change how your body moves to help the shape and the path that the club moves on is super important.
super important. And I think sometimes
It might be all we have at our disposal.
sometimes, what looks odd to somebody, with what people do at the top of the backswing might be done in an effort to increase range of motion. Range of motion is fundamental to generating energy. So from a mechanic.
So here we are with Dr. Nesbit, probably golf's most published researcher.
I'll take that.
So tell us how you got started in golf, what you found, and why you think it's important to start passing it along to us golf pros.
Sure. About a year after I got here, a representative from the USGA came by. They were looking for somebody who would be interested in modeling golf clubs. So as part of their research division for club compliance testing and all that, they wanted somebody to come with models, computer models of clubs. And so nobody wanted to do it, so I did it. And then it's where I met Frank Thomas, and through a series of fortunate coincidences, we were able to kind of extrapolate from just modeling clubs to actually doing more of a comprehensive biomechanical study of the golfer, the whole swing. And so the biomechanics is looking at the kinematics, which are the motions that the golfer makes in swinging the club, and then also the kinetics, which are the forces and the torques that cause those motions. So I started working with them to basically figure out what were the inputs that the golfer imposed on the club, so ultimately they could use that to help them make decisions on what is really important to the behavior of the club, and ultimately whether it should be allowed into the game or not. So I started working back then. We had motion analysis equipment, which was kind of new at the time. So cameras for basically figuring out what various points on the golfer were doing. So that was available. And then also the software for doing a three-dimensional kinematic and kinetic analysis was becoming available. So prior to that point, if you wanted to do a three-dimensional kinematic or kinetic analysis of any dynamic system, it was immensely complicated. And basically that complication was a barrier to doing a more realistic biomechanical study of the golfer. Previous studies to that point were all based upon pretty significant simplifications and limitations that were necessary to make it a tractable or solvable problem. But at that time, those tools became available, so we didn't have to do those things. And then also through the vision of Frank Thomas, we had the motivation and really the resources to actually do it. So that's when it started. So we had access to some really good golfers. We had the equipment, we had the software, so we just started analyzing three-dimensionally the kinematics and kinetics of very, very good golfers. And from my point of view, I'm not a golfer. So I was not burdened with any preconceived notions of what I should find. So with that, I just let the physics and Newton's laws tell me what was happening. And so that's how it started. We generated a pretty significant database of golfers, what they did when they swung the club, what they did mostly relative to the club. So what were the motions, the positions, velocities, and accelerations, as well as the forces and torques that they applied at the handle. We did some stuff with the body, but that was sort of secondary to what was happening in the club. And then I expanded upon that with more golfers, more in-depth analysis, more analyses relative to what might be significant to the golfer themselves. So what the planes were doing and that kind of thing. And then you guys showed up. So that's kind of where the story starts, I guess.
Right. So when you tell us a little bit about the model that you created of the golfer, what was different about that? Like, I know you have a background in robotics.
Right. The background that I had I did kinematic and kinetic analyses of the robot arm. And a robot arm is significant in that it's a three-dimensional machine mechanism, right? And it's a serial chain of joints, very much like a human being, a serial chain of joints. So I learned how to do the dynamic and kinematic kinetic analysis of a robot arm by looking at the movements and the forces and torques, the various chain of these segments, right? So based upon my study of robotics in grad school, I used the same methodologies to come up with a serial chain mechanism that represented a human. And the difference being that the segments were now more representative of a human body segment, and the joints were restricted based upon what the joints of the human body do. We didn't make any assumptions relative to what movements the body could make. So sort of a well-known one is we didn't restrict the path of the hands to remain in one plane, so we moved away from the two-dimensional restriction, and then we also did not have any restrictions on what the hand path could do. So previous models restricted them to two-dimensional paths and a constant radius path, which, you know, based upon a first sort of visual analysis of a golf swing, seems reasonable.
Right. It looks circular.
It looks circular enough.
When you say a constant radius, you mean it would be a perfect circle?
It would make a perfect arc.
Right.
Yeah, sure. One point where everything was rotating about that point. And it was a good start. It was a reasonable way to approach a sort of very difficult problem to solve. But when we had the tools, we didn't have to have those restrictions.
So what were some of the most interesting findings you found out first before we get into the mechanics of the swing or anything? What shocked you the most, other than the hub path, which we'll get into?
Okay, certainly. I guess from an overall point of view was the relative complexity of the swing and the sort of the complex interactions that are occurring in the swing. And these interactions, I mean, are relative to how the golfer applies the force to the handle and the changing direction that the force undergoes during the swing, the torques that the golfer applies, same sort of thing. The profiles of the torques, or the changing magnitudes, the different components of the torques, and really the biggest thing was the contribution that energy or work has on generating club head speed. So, you know, sort of a question that always gets asked is why body type seems to have little effect on the ability to generate club head speed.
So like a little guy can hit just as far as a big guy.
Right, right. And so we found that it's the forces and torques and the ability to apply those forces and torques over the range of motion. So that gives you your energy. That was a big one, because it just seems obvious why it doesn't seem to matter. And then the other thing was that the human body would generate far more energy than it needs to swing the golf club. So the ability to transfer that energy out to the club is a big factor in generating the club head speed. So those were the main ones.
Was it obvious to you, because you were a non-golfer, that golf was a hard game when you saw it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd been out to the driving range enough to know that you know, hitting a little ball straight was with some distance was a challenge. So I have that much experience to know that.
Okay.
But yeah, the thing that a lot of people ask is, what is the one thing that's most important? And the one thing is, there is no one thing.
There is no one thing.
That was a revelation. Not so much to me, because I didn't have any preconceived notions of what it should be. And the other thing is that there is no one way to do it, because of so many factors involved. The notion that you can take any golfer and fit them within one sort of pattern and make them into a professional, I think is a bit misguided.
Gotcha. All right, Steve.
Oh, hey, my pleasure.
We're looking forward to what you continue to do in golf. Please don't quit on golf. We need you. You've saved a lot of people's golf swings and
Well,
things.
actually, I guess since you're recording, you know, what I did was very enjoyable to me, and I think it had some benefit for the USGA and some of the considerations they had for rulemaking. But it's what you guys have done in taking what normally just gets buried in some journal and translating it to something that is useful for the golfer. I mean, it's beneficial for me. It's beneficial for whom I work for. It adds to the knowledge of the sports, and ultimately it has some benefits to the next person who wants to pick up. But you guys are the ones that have actually done the work to make it meaningful for people who play and for coach.